Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is October 15th, 2024, and today we will be going over John Reed's seminal book about the Russian Revolution, 10 Days That Shook the World. As a quick reminder, the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies is a Party of Communist USA initiated school, so this does allow us to have a wide variety of ranges of topics and discussions. So tonight we will start off with a short biography of John Reed. We will also have an introduction by Lenin, and we will go over part of the preface of 10 Days That Shook the World by John Reed himself. The second part will be part 2 of the preface. We'll then have a timeline of the major events in the book or of the 10 days, and then our final section will be excerpts from the book. Again, if you have your own copy from New Outlook Publishers, please try to follow along. Otherwise, we do encourage you to find a other copy and get the book from New Outlook Publishers.
Biography of John Reed. He was born in Portland, Oregon on October 22nd, 1887, to an upper-class family. Attended Harvard in 1906 and graduated in 1910. Wrote poetry in and about New York City, where he lived. In 1913, joined the editorial board of The Masses, and also went to Mexico as a correspondent of the Mexican Revolution. In April 30th, 1914, Reed arrived in Colorado, where the Ludlow massacre had taken place, and came to deeply support the class struggle following interviews with the miners. He was a war correspondent during the First World War and had expressed his disappointment with the Second Internationale backing the war. Reported on the events in Petrograd leading up to the revolution in November 17, and he was one of the founders of the Communist Party USA. He died in 1920, and he is one of the 3 Americans buried at the Kremlin. So 10 Days That Shook the World, a preface. Lenin's introduction. With the greatest interest and with never slackening attention, I read John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World. Unreservedly, I do recommend it to the workers of the world. Here is a book which I should like to see published in millions of copies and translated into all languages. It gives a truthful and most vivid exposition of the events so significant to the comprehension of what really is the proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. These problems are widely discussed, but before one can accept or reject these ideas, he must understand the full significance of his decision. John Reed's book will undoubtedly help to clear this question, which is the fundamental problem of the international labor movement. And we have a picture of Lenin right there, and it was written in 1919. The preface by John Reed himself. This book is a slice of intensified history as I saw it. It does not pretend to be anything but a detailed account of the November Revolution. When the Bolsheviki, at the head of the workers and soldiers, seized the state power of Russia and placed it in the hands of the Soviets, naturally, most of it deals with Red Petrograd, the capital and heart of the insurrection. But the reader must realize that what took place in Petrograd was almost exactly duplicated with greater or lesser intensity at different intervals of time all over Russia. In this book, the first of several which I am writing, I must confine myself to a chronicle of those events which I myself observed and experienced, and those supported by reliable evidence, preceded by 2 chapters briefly outlining the background and causes of the November Revolution. I am aware that these 2 chapters make difficult reading, but they are essential to an understanding of what follows. And as a note, most people understand it as October Revolution, but because of the calendar differences between the East and the West, what we considered November, they considered October. Preface by John Reed. Many questions will suggest themselves to the mind of the reader. What is Bolshevism? What kind of a government structure did the Bolsheviki set up? If the Bolsheviki championed the Constituent Assembly before the November Revolution, why did they disperse it by force of arms afterwards? And if the bourgeoisie opposed the Constituent Assembly until the danger of Bolshevism came apparent, why did they champion it afterward?
We will now break for a round of discussions and questions.
Yeah, just some quick clarification. There were actually, I know a lot of people know this, but there were two revolutions in the span of 2 months. The November one, which started the Duma, and then the second one, which was the actual Communist Party revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, a later part of the preface will actually have a picture of Kerensky and explain that point. So thank you. There we go.
Yes. Excuse me. So I actually read this book just about 2 months ago, and I have a question. It's not directly related to the book itself, but it's something that's mentioned, and it's a very basic question. But for the life of me, I don't know what a Soviet actually is. My understanding, especially after I read this book, is that it was prior to the actual revolution. It was something like a sort of potential alternative government to the provisional government, but we obviously don't have anything like that in this country. So how would one define a Soviet exactly? What is it?
So part of the book itself, John Reed has a list of terms and organizations that are referenced. So for him, he says the word Soviet means council. Under the Tsar, the Imperial Council of State was called the Государственный Soviet. Since the revolution, however, the term Soviet has come to be associated with a certain type of parliament elected by members of working class economic organizations, the Soviet of Workers, Soldiers, Peasants' Deputies. And he says, I've heretofore limited the word to these bodies, and wherever else it occurs, I have translated it council.
There were different types of Soviets. There were the workers' Soviets, there were the soldiers' deputies Soviets, and then later on, there were the nationalities Soviets. They were all representative bodies.
And we're all recallable.
Yeah, I find it amazing. I didn't know this about John Reed, but like starting with Che, he was sort of upper middle class family. Then Mao came from prosperous farmers, and it's just amazing how many of fellow comrades come from middle upper class echelons. I just find that interesting.
Yes, so John Reed's father was a factory owner and then also owned an energy company. And then his mother came from a high-class family. He was raised by servants in the household. He went to Harvard. He did theater, journalism, debate. Yeah, he was definitely from the upper class. And then when he graduated, he was trying to get as a freelance journalist, and what he really wanted to be was a war correspondent, which he got the chance to do. But I also found it interesting that he started on the editorial board of The Masses, which is one of the precursors to Masses and Mainstreams. And then I think he did that with Sam Ingleton, who later became a conservative and switched ideologies. So it's rather fascinating.
I want to mention that this book is very important for communists. This is what we came out of. This is very important that people understand that. Socialists changed their ideology. The Second International, you heard what he said. They supported World War One, and they supported going into World War One. All the communists did not. So it's important to understand that this book and the history of the Bolshevik Revolution is the history of communists. Any person who says they're a communist and do not talk about Lenin and the revolution, they are not communist. Okay, that's very important that you remember that. They're not. They're wannabes. Gus Hall, General Secretary of the CPUSA, said these are wannabes. They want to be communist, but they're not communist. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
Yeah, I was just curious. Is there any kind of like if I was to go like if we were to go read this book, is there any kind of context that is important to understand the book, like on the factions in the book or anything like that?
So yes, the beginning of the book, John Reed breaks down a lot of the different political groups and the parties that were active during that time and afterwards. He also breaks down a little bit of the parliamentary procedure, some of the popular organizations, different central committees, other organizations, and he goes into detail to define what they are and what's their importance in the book. So where when you're reading through, you're like, oh, okay, this is referring to this group. But yes, it's very well defined and it's quite easy to read through.
When you're talking about a lot of famous communists come from wealthy backgrounds, what I think about it is they you can't bribe them. They already came from a wealthy background, so they can't be bought out. They already sacrificed. They could have been a parasite, but they chose not to be, unlike most people. So in a way, they're kind of better for that they're not.
They're the kind of class traders that are good, you could say. If there are no other comments or questions, we'll go to the second section. And General Secretary Joe, this is yours, Preface Part 2.
Okay, this is from the Preface by John Reed. In considering the rise of the Bolsheviki, it is necessary to understand that Russian economic life and the Russian army were not disorganized on November 7th, 1917, but many months before, as a logical result of a process which began as far back as 1915. The corrupt reactionaries in control of the Tsar's court deliberately undertook to wreck Russia in order to make a separate peace with Germany. The lack of arms on the front, which had caused the Great Retreat of the summer of 1915, the lack of food in the army and in the great cities, the breakdown of manufactures and transportation in 1916, all these we now know were part of a gigantic campaign of sabotage. This was halted just in time by the March Revolution. And on the right is Alexander Kerensky, who led the bourgeois provisional government between the Tsar and the Bolsheviks. So the first few months of the new regime, in spite of the confusion incident upon a great revolution, when 160 millions of the world's most oppressed people suddenly achieved liberty, both the internal situation and the combative power of the army actually improved. But the honeymoon was short. The property classes wanted merely a political revolution which would take the power from the Tsar and give it to them. They wanted Russia to be a constitutional republic like France or the United States, or a constitutional monarchy like England. On the other hand, the masses of the people wanted real industrial and agrarian democracy. William English Walling, in his book Russia's Message, an account of the revolution of 1905, describes very well the state of mind of the Russian workers, who were later to support Bolshevism almost unanimously. They, being the working people, saw it was possible that even under a free government, if it fell into the hands of other social classes, they might still continue to starve. The Russian workman is revolutionary, but he is neither violent, dogmatic, nor unintelligent. He is ready for barricades, but he has studied them, and alone of the workers of the world, he has learned about them from actual experience. He is ready and willing to fight his oppressor, the capitalist class, to a finish, but he does not ignore the existence of other classes. He merely asks that the other classes take one side or the other in the bitter conflict that draws near. They, the workers, were all agreed that our American political institutions were preferable to their own, but they were not very anxious to exchange one despot for another, i.e., the capitalist class. Between these two extremes, with the other factions which wholeheartedly or half-heartedly supported them, were the so-called moderate socialists, the Mensheviki and socialist revolutionaries, and several smaller parties. And the socialist revolutionaries were the ultra-left force at the time. These groups were also attacked by the property classes, but their power of resistance was crippled by their theories. Roughly, the Mensheviki and the socialist revolutionaries believed that Russia was not economically ripe for a social revolution, that only a political revolution was possible. According to their interpretation, the Russian masses were not educated enough to take over the power. Any attempt to do so would inevitably bring on a reaction, by means of which some ruthless opportunists might restore the old regime. And so it followed that when the moderate socialists were forced to assume the power, they were afraid to use it. From this, it was an easy step to supporting them. The moderate socialists needed the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie did not need the moderate socialists. So it resulted in the socialist ministers being obliged to give way, little by little, on their entire program, while the property classes grew more and more insistent. It is still fashionable, after a whole year of the Soviet government, to speak of the Bolshevik insurrection as an adventure, quote unquote. Adventure it was, and one of the most marvelous mankind ever embarked upon, sweeping into history at the head of the toiling masses and staking everything on their vast and simple desires. Already, the machinery had been set up by which the land of the great estates could be distributed among the peasants. The factory shop committees and the trade unions were there to put into operation workers' control of industry. In every village, town, city, district, and province, there were Soviets of workers, soldiers, and peasants' deputies, prepared to assume the task of local administration. No matter what one thinks of Bolshevism, it is undeniable that the Russian Revolution is one of the great events of human history, and the rise of the Bolsheviki a phenomenon of worldwide importance. Just as historians search the records for the minutest details of the story of the Paris Commune, so they will want to know what happened in Petrograd in November 1917, the spirit which animated the people, and how the leaders looked, talked, and acted. It is with this in view that I have written this book. And again, this is from the preface.
Thank you, General Secretary Joe. We'll now break for our second round of discussions.
As soon as they started to get the ball rolling, do we know where they specifically got their armaments? Did it come from the deserters of the army? Did they raid some warehouses of guns? How did the Soviets get their arms? Thank you.
As kind of mentioned, there were also soldier Soviets. So there were some Soviets that were soldiers. There were some deserters in the armies. There was some armories raided. But in what assisted the Soviets was that there was the army itself backing them, and they were also weary from the war. Never mind those who were with either, say, the cadets or who were with the White Guards or the generals.
Yeah, I could probably look this up, but it was mentioned in that preface that he was going to write other volumes. I don't know if he got around to doing that. Did he? Because I know that he, I guess, passed away like during the Civil War. At least that's what I remember from the movie Reds. But what else is John Reed known for after he wrote 10 Days of
So
Nick
he wrote about his experiences in Mexico. He actually compiled that into a book. He also did his correspondence in Eastern Europe. He did something like that. He's also put a bunch of different articles out about the Soviets, like Red Russia, Triumphs of the Bolsheviks, and a bunch of others that probably he was going to put into another book, but he died before he could do that.
And when did he, so was it 1920? When did he pass?
So he passed away in 1920. It was actually from, I believe, what was it? It wasn't typhus. Well, he got a disease and he died there. And actually, part of it was he was running around as a ambassador for the Comintern and was doing work for them and trying to go see people, but he was getting a lot of work from none other than Zinoviev. So go figure. If there are no other hands, questions, or comments, we'll return to the next section, to our presentation. This is going to be section number 3, which is a timeline of the 10 days that shook the world.
Timeline of the book. Day 1, Tuesday, October 24th, 1917. In the early hours of October 24th, Kerensky ordered troops loyal to the government, by this stage a regiment of cadets and reservists, to take action against Bolshevik activists. Yeah. The Petrograd garrison releases a resolution stating that, quote, the army demands peace, the peasants' land, and the workers' bread and work, end quote. Day 2, Wednesday, October 25th, 1917. Bolshevik Red Guards moved on the government positions around the city of Petrograd. They then invaded the Winter Palace, where several government ministers were resident. Within hours, the provisional government had been deposed and its members had either fled or been arrested. On October the 25th, the Bolsheviks captured Petrograd and the Winter Palace, arresting the provisional government. Lenin announces that the Bolsheviks have seized power and calls for the preparations for a Soviet government. Menshevik and moderate SR delegates walk out of the Congress of the Soviets. Day 3, October 26th, Thursday, October 26, 1917. The Bolsheviks announced that their official government title as the, quote, government of the People's Commissars, end quote, which is to be led by Lenin and is now in control of Russia, announced it would amend the land program and negotiate for immediate peace 18 hours after seizing power. Lenin issued the decree on land calling for the abolition of private ownership and the decree on peace urging an immediate ceasefire and treaty. Day 4, Friday, October 27th, 1917. Little revolutionary action is seen outside Petrograd. Day 5, Saturday, October 28th, 1917. Posters and newspapers appeared disclaiming Bolshevik authority and criticizing their actions. And I assume this is a picture of one of the Soviets.
And so this is a picture of the People's Commissar. You can see Lenin in the background over there.
All right. Day 6, Sunday, October 29th, 1917. A day of counter-revolution. The center of the resistance against the Bolshevik was on the outskirts of Petrograd. Kerensky orders regiments to lay down their arms, to which they fire against the barracks. Day 7, Monday, October 30th, 1917. The Proletarian Army defeats attacking Cossacks. Day 8, Tuesday, October 31st, 1917. The Bolsheviks begin to gain control of the situation. Day 9, 1st of November, 1917. The Bolsheviks appeal to counter-revolutionaries to lay down their arms. Day 10, 2nd of November, 1917. Quote, having easily conquered power, the Bolsheviks cannot make use of it, end quote. An editorial from the non-Bolshevik paper. Lenin's reply, quote, shame upon those who are of little faith, who doubt, who allow themselves to be frightened by the bourgeoisie, end quote.
We'll go to our third discussion round.
Yeah, sorry, I'm finding this class really fascinating. I read or heard somewhere that the Civil War was actually the real challenge and the revolution was only a small part of it. I just want to clarify, did the Civil War come after this? Or was it all sort of one big kerfuffle? Thank you.
Correct. So the Civil War came after this. Literally, though, the Red Guard and the Bolsheviks just marched into the Winter Palace virtually unopposed. It was only the Civil War where there was actual real fighting.
Well, I just wanted to say so the Civil War, when it happened after after the Bolsheviks got Russia out of World War I. the Allies were angry with them, and they joined up with all their reactionary friends of the monarch, especially the Black Hundreds. They were the most reactionary force, and they funded and armed these people to attack the Soviet government.
Yeah, basically, yeah, it was a really big deal because not only were the Bolsheviks faced against the Mensheviks, the SRs, Socialist Revolutionaries, and also various other reactionary forces, including what Tyler said, the Black Hundreds, and even the anarchists. There was also the coalition that was formed. I believe it was 11 different nations. I believe overlapping like almost the exact same ones that instigated the against the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. So 11 nations, capitalist nations. You're talking Japan, Austria-Hungary. All of these countries actually directly got involved in the civil war against the Bolsheviks. So it was a colossal effort for the Bolsheviks to even survive, let alone regain all of that territory, industrial capacity, and somehow stay afloat and stable simultaneously. That's all.
This was the time that Churchill made a famous statement: let's strangle the Soviet baby in its cradle now so that it won't grow up. So Churchill was forever anti-Soviet. He had to eat those words in World War II when he said that if it wasn't for Stalin and the Soviet Union, we would have lost the war. That's the same Churchill. So he did change his mind after experiencing what happened in World War II. But yeah, it was 14 nations that intervened in the area of Murmansk and Archangel, which is in northern Russia, and they intervened and they were defeated. It was very important they were defeated. But this civil war destroyed the country. Therefore, because it destroyed the country, all trade and everything was stopped. So Lenin instituted something called NEP, along with Nikolai Bukharin, which was the new economic policy. And it was a way to bring back some kind of capitalism in order to get the country off center because it had stopped. And the Soviet Union was declared in 1922.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. Also, another fun fact, one of the industrialists in America who owned a lot of industry around this time was none other than future President Herbert Hoover. Had the Russian Revolution not happened, he would have been one of the richest men in America in the 1930s. But he also made it his mission to not recognize the Soviet Union and to do intrigue against it. Wonder why. Comrade Chris Beauvais, National Secretary, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Very interesting to hear about Herbert Hoover, by the way. Yeah, so the Comrade Angelo spoke about how the industry was destroyed, the infrastructure, basically. And as we know, Russia was the weakest link in the capitalist chain as well. But I raised my hand to put a book recommendation that every comrade who, whether you're here at the class today or listening in on one of the different social medias, we recommend everyone start their own Marxist library. And one of the books New Outlook Publishers has is the autobiography or biography of Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky. And what's funny about Dzerzhinsky, I guess this is historiography for you, that's the study of history itself. He's remembered as being Iron Phoenix, the head of the Cheka, which was the previous KGB. However, Felix Dzerzhinsky was actually a Bolshevik from Poland. He was Polish, and he was actually the head of like the Soviet transport. Like he was in charge of the ports, of the railroads, of the electrification of the country, and he actually built the Soviet infrastructure in the Soviet times of the Soviet Republic. And we have his book. It's one of those things you just can't find. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to have a couple excerpts from the book. And really quick on the next screen, just a small note. It says in the CEK, this is actually referring to the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, but it was more called by the initials of its name, CEK.
On November 27th, a committee of Cossacks came to Smolny to the Trotsky and to see Trotsky and Lenin. They demanded if it were true that the Soviet government did not intend to divide the Cossack lands among the peasants of Great Russia? No, answered Trotsky. The Cossacks deliberated for a while. They asked, does the Soviet government intend to confiscate the estates of our great Cossack landowners and divide them among the working Cossacks? To this, Lenin replied, that, he said, is for you to do. We shall support the working Cossacks in all their action. The best way to begin is to form Cossack Soviets. You will be given representation in the Seika, and then it will be your government too. The Cossacks departed, thinking hard. 2 weeks later, General Kaledin received a deputation from his troops. Will you, they asked, promise to divide the great estates of the Cossack landlords among the working Cossacks? Over my dead body, responded Kaledin. A month later, seeing his army melt away before his eyes, Kaledin blew out his brains, and the Cossack movement was no more. Mountains of dirt and rock were piled high near the base of the wall. Climbing these, looked down into two massive pits, 10 or 15 feet deep and 50 yards long, where hundreds of soldiers and workers were digging in light of huge fires. A young student spoke to us in German. The Brotherhood grave, he explained. Tomorrow we shall bury here 500 proletarians who died for the revolution. He took us down to the pit in frantic haste, swung the pit, picks and shovels, and earth mountains grew. No one spoke. Over the night was thick with stars. An ancient imperial Kremlin wall towered up immeasurably. Here in this holy place, said a student, holiest of all Russia, we shall bury our most holy. Here are the tombs of the czars. Our czar, the people shall sleep. His arm was in a sling from bullet wound gained in the fighting. He looked at it. You foreigners look down on us, Russians, because so long we tolerated a medieval monarchy, he said. But we saw that the Tsar was not the only tyrant in the world. Capitalism was worse, and in all of the countries of the world, capitalism was an emperor. Russian revolutionary tactics are best. With the decree of nationalization of the banks, the formation of the Supreme Council of the People's Economy, the putting of practical operations of the land decree into the villages, the democratic reorganization of the army, and the sweeping changes in all branches of the government and of life. With all these effect only by the will of the masses of workers, soldiers and peasants, slowly began many mistakes and hitches, the molding of proletarian Russia. Not by compromise with the property classes or with the political leaders, not by consultating the old government mechanism did the Bolsheviki conquer the power, nor by the organized violence of a small clique. If the masses all over Russia has not been ready for insurrection, it must have failed. The only reason the Bolsheviki success lay in their accomplishing the vast and simple desires of the most profound strata of the people, calling for them to work of the tearing down and destroying the old, and afterward, in the smoke of falling ruins, cooperating with them to erect the framework of the new.
Go to our final discussion round. Really quick, a couple of backgrounds. So one of the slides was about a General Kaledin. He was the general of a regiment of Cossacks who actually rose up against the Bolsheviks. And after some fighting, in one of the meetings, basically the Cossack soldiers went to Trotsky and Lenin and were like, hey, is it true that you're going to divide all our lands among the peasants? No, said Trotsky. And then they said, well, is the Soviet government intending to take over the estates of the great Cossack landowners and give them to the workers? And Lenin said, that's you guys' job to do. And when they asked that same question to their general, he said, only over my dead body. And at which point they deserted and his offensive died out against him.
Okay, so my question was kind of on that topic because that was I felt like out of context, it was very romanticized. Like, I mean, he just kind of blew his head off. But my understanding is there were Cossack groups that, once again, were fighting in the Civil War, and on the whites, on the White Russian side. Obviously, there was a Soviet for the Cossacks, but I guess it really had to do with not the Cossacks themselves, but it was just what do you call it, like the bourgeois of the Cossacks that kind of led that, or was it that they were kind of nomads also that was kind of closer to the Western world? I know that they kind of settled in a lot of Ukrainian places, but I don't know. I just kind of felt like it's the Cossack. What do you want to call it? Not resistance, anti-communist resistance didn't really stop there when he blew his head off. It sounds like they were still around and were fighting the Bolsheviks.
Comrade Angelo, did you want to respond? I see your hand went up.
Yes, I want to tell you what the Cossacks represented. The Cossacks were the sort of national police force of the Tsar. That's who they were. So whenever there was any uprising, the Cossacks were the ones who put down the uprising. When they had pogroms, which were anti-Jewish attacks on the villages, on the settlements of the Jews, it was the Cossacks who came in with their sabers and chopped people's heads off and killed them. So the Cossacks were a dreaded word. So much so that after the 1905 revolution failed, there was a big influx of immigrants from Russia. Big influx. Came here to the United States. Many of them settled in New York and the Lower East Side. When the police in New York rode horses and they went into a crowd of strikers, they just disassembled the strikers the same way that they did in the old country with the Cossacks. So these immigrants, they yelled out at the cops. I know some of these people because I spoke to them when I was younger. They yelled out to the cops, Cossacks, Cossacks, which was a bad, dirty word. That's how they reminded these poor immigrant workers who built the trade unions in New York, many of them who were Jewish, by the way. And they noticed right away that these were the Cossacks. So the Cossacks were never a positive element. That's all I want to just give you that footnote. Thank you.
Okay. Some background about the second one. That second quote, I believe, was after John Reed said about 500 proletarians who died for the revolution. The number actually turned out to be closer to 258. But these were one of the largest burials of people who were interned into the Kremlin wall. And besides John Reed, the only two other Americans are C.E. Ruthenberg and Big Bill Haywood. You might know Big Bill as one of the founders of the IWW and a labor activist. We will go to our wrap-up section then in that case. New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house, and for an update on that, I will turn the floor over to.
Thank you. Please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. Like Mark said earlier, we would like everybody to start their own Marxist-Leninist library. And of course, you could find 10 Days That Shook the World on New Outlook Publishers and another relevant book. And we'll actually be having a class on that book next week, The October Revolution by Stalin. And of course, our latest release, which we released last week, but we got cut off. We didn't have enough time to do the closeouts last week, but it was Trotskyism in the Service of Franco, a documentary account of the treachery by the POUM in Spain. I recommend everybody get that one. That is a great work. And of course, another important work, lest we forget. Once again, you can find that at newoutlookpublishers.store. Purchasing books from Outlook Publishers does help support the school.
And we will close out with other scenes of the Internationale from the movie Reds.